AJFF In Conversation, the webinar, is made possible by the generous support of the Helen Marie Stern Fund.
Hi, I'm Sarah Glassberg.
I'm Brad Pilcher.
And this is AJFF In Conversation, the podcast, except not really.
This is not one of our normal episodes, but instead it's a bonus recording of a live webinar we recently hosted with actor Jesse Eisenberg and writer-director Jonathan Jakubowicz.
This was a live Q&A for the new film Resistance, based on the true story of legendary mime Marcel Marceau and his efforts to save Holocaust orphans with the help of the French resistance.
If you have not already seen Resistance, you probably should fix that, and soon. And thankfully, it's widely available on a host of platforms. Rather than list them all, you can go to resistance.movie/watch-at-home and find your preferred viewing platform of choice.
Please enjoy this wonderful conversation. But before we get to that, please remember you can always find out more from us, as well as show notes and information on future webinars at ajff.org/inconversation.
So now let's listen to Jesse Eisenberg, Jonathan Jakubowicz, and moderator Dr. Catherine Lewis.
Imagine fighting this war as a civilian. Imagine not knowing how to shoot a gun, challenging the Nazis to save lives. I have just heard an incredible story. That makes your sacrifices completely worth it.
123 children. Their parents were just killed by Nazis.
We need to train them to survive. What good does it do to teach them fear? I think it's important to help the children laugh in the middle of this war.
There's a group in Lyon arming themselves to fight back.
We need to find guns. We need to learn how to shoot.
Do you really think I could help anyone with a gun?
Of course not.
Your passports are impressive.
Look at this. Marcel Marceau.
It's a great name.
Welcome to the Resistance.
Why are we fighting a war we can't win? We can kill all the Nazis.
You can kill some.
Or you can save some lives. We want to take them out to France to see if we can get across the border.
Tell me where they are.
I don't know where they are.
You do know!
In every generation, they rise up against us. Sometimes a powerful man, sometimes an army tries to destroy the Jewish people. But here we are, together. You are not alone.
What's the best way to resist? It's not to kill them. It's to survive.
Greetings, and welcome to AJFF In Conversation, a presentation of the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival and a part of expanded virtual programming in response to COVID-19. AJFF In Conversation is presented in partnership with American Jewish Committee and made possible thanks to the generous contributions of funders, community partners, and volunteers, and you, our loyal audience. Become a member of the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival today and help sustain AJFF during these challenging times. Thank you for your support. We can only do more of this with more of you. To learn more about our efforts to stay engaged and connected with you and our community during the crisis, visit us online at ajff.org or follow us on social. And now, the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival proudly presents our feature program.
Good evening. Welcome to our first webinar for the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival. We just celebrated our 20th anniversary, so this is an exciting time. This evening's event is part of the festival's ongoing year-round programming, and we're delighted to have you join us for this inaugural event. I'm Dr. Catherine Lewis, Assistant Vice President for Museums, Archives, and Rare Books, and Executive Director of the Museum of History and Holocaust Education at Kennesaw State University. I've been involved in the AJFF for many years, and I'll serve as your moderator this evening. This is an unusual time, and I'm hoping that everyone online is doing well. By way of format, we'll begin with a moderated conversation with the lead actor of the film and the director. That will be followed by a Q&A with our virtual audience. You're welcome to submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, and let me remind you that's across the bottom. If you happen to be in full screen, you might need to reduce that a little bit so you can see that tab. Now, this evening's feature film, Resistance, tells a little-known story of Marcel Marceau. We see him at the height of World War II, an aspiring Jewish actor who would later become one of the world's most famous performers. He joins the French resistance to save children orphaned by the Nazis, and it is an extraordinary story. Now, I have two guests this evening, of course, Jesse Eisenberg, who plays Marceau in the film. Now, you'll know him from the Academy-nominated role as Mark Zuckerberg in the 2010 film The Social Network. He's also starred in The Squid and the Whale, Adventureland, The Education of Charlie Banks, 30 Minutes or Less, Now You See Me, and Zombieland. He played Lex Luthor in 2016, Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice. We're also joined by Jonathan Jakubowicz, the noted Venezuelan filmmaker and writer, whose film Sequestro Express was nominated Best Foreign Language Film at the British Independent Film Awards in 2005. His second film, Hands of Stone, premiered at Cannes in 2016 and was warmly received with a 15-minute standing ovation. In addition, Jonathan wrote and directed Ships of Hope, a documentary recounting the journey of refugee Jews on a ship fleeing Nazi Germany to Venezuela. So let's begin our conversation about this extraordinary film. Jesse and Jonathan, thank you both for being with us. Tell us where you're joining us from this evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. I'm joining from Los Angeles.
Great. And Jesse?
In Bloomington, Indiana.
Terrific. And how are y'all faring in this crisis? Let's start with that, and then we'll dig into some of the questions.
Well, I think like everyone, it may be a bit better for a writer because I work at home, so my everyday routine hasn't completely changed. But, it is a difficult time. And, we have a daughter, she's not going to school. So we have to split our time now between being the school and working. And right. It's just very, very strange seeing everything empty and not being able to go out, meet with friends. It's difficult, but I think it's been a lot less difficult than for the people of New York and even for right. friends that I have in Madrid and Paris. So I'm not complaining.
Of course. And Jesse?
Yes, quite similar. We're in a small town that hasn't yet felt the really broad effects that, major urban centers are feeling. In fact, in our county, there are few cases, with the exception of the mayor's wife, who we're friends with, who has, who's ill. Of course, even though it is, I would say, a little more diffuse here, we still end up knowing people.
Of course. Well, again, thank you for joining us. Let's start with Jonathan. This is, of course, a very personal story for you. More than 400 members of your family were killed in the Holocaust. What does it mean for you to make a film about this tragic period?
Well, it was unthinkable for me for a while because it was so personal and so emotional for me. I grew up hearing these stories and, all my childhood. I guess what changed my decision to approach this period is that this is not a movie about extermination. It's a movie about salvation. And I was truly inspired by what the characters did and what it says. And I, as soon as I heard that Marcel Marceau saved children in the world, the fact that I knew so much about Marcel, but I never knew this story made me very curious. And I started doing research and I was able to track down his first cousin, George Loinger, who's the person in the film that you see that invites him into the resistance. He was 106 years old living in Paris. And when I was actually premiering Hands of Stone in Cannes, I was starting to do research for this, and I learned that he was in Paris, and I was able to contact him, and I met with him. You know, he was 106 and was completely perfect, you know, mentally, and remembered the story and told me a lot of what you see in the film. And it's, you know, from then on, I knew I couldn't stop until I made this movie. I stopped everything else and I did, you know, and it was an incredible research process and an incredible, very fulfilling and inspiring piece of work, because everybody asked me, you know, how can you work for 3 years in a story about the Holocaust? And it's actually the opposite. You're never depressed. You're actually inspired because this story in particular, you know, is about people who, in the worst possible circumstances, decided to like renounce their selfish, you know, interest and save people. And I think in the last few years, everyone else but me has been thinking the world is in a terrible moment. You know, you have this constant relationship with this so much more horrific moment in time, and you're in touch with characters who in that moment decided to make a difference. Every problem right now, even the epidemic, feels like it's small compared to what they were going through. And it's been inspiring all the way through and emotional too, because I was shooting, you know, we shot in Prague. My grandfather, who lost most of his family, went to school in Prague. So, and my family is from Poland, and Marcel's father is from Poland. And, you know, I have 4 relatives in Schindler's List. You know, I mean, it's been part of every part of my life. And a lot of the story of the little girl in the film is inspired by my aunt, because I couldn't find a specific story about a little girl that was in the group that Marcel saved. So I decided to draw inspiration from another Holocaust survivor, which is, you know, my mother's sister, who's called Elizabeth, and the character in the movie is called Elspeth. So it couldn't be more personal. It couldn't be more emotional, and it paid off, because I think the emotion was transmitted into the script, was transmitted to the actors, and for what I've seen now that the movie has been out for a few weeks, it definitely reaches the audience, and it makes them emotional in the right way. And it's because there wasn't a single part of this process that wasn't, you know, extremely personal for me.
Of course. And tell us about the casting. You have some powerful, well-known figures, of course, Marceau, that Jesse portrays, but also George Patton and Klaus Barbie. How did you make those casting decisions?
Well, Jesse, I actually, from the moment I started writing, you know, I always write with an actor in mind, you know, and I started doing research, and I learned that Jesse's mother was a professional clown, and I learned that part of his family was also killed in the Holocaust. So I had, you know, the feeling that he would connect to the story, and I literally wrote it with him in mind. And you know, it was fantastic, because he was first curious about the project, but then we started a collaboration on the script that went on for months, you know, all the way to the shoot, and it was really interesting. I really love working with, you know, actors, but specifically with really intelligent actors, because they end up making you look better. You know, their script, I'm not as good as the script is, you know, if I am working with great actors, you know, they end up embodying the character, and there's a point in which you feel that they know more about the character than even you do, you know, and it was a really special collaboration with Jesse and all the actors. I mean, working with Ed Harris and working with Matthias, who plays Klaus Barbie, but also working with all the other actors who are, you know, very well known in their specific countries in Europe, but not that known for the rest of the world. But they're all very intelligent and well-prepared actors. You know, when you work with actors in Europe, usually they've gone to like the Royal Academy of Arts, you know, and performance, and it's very, very specific. When you direct them to do this, they do exactly what you said, because they have tools that they learn in school.
Indeed. Indeed.
But it was, they all had a very specific emotional, personal connection to the story. Clémence Possy, who plays Emma in the film, her grandmother was in the French Resistance. Felix Moati, who plays Jesse's brother, is also Jewish and also had family in the French Resistance in Tunisia. I can go on about, and even the kids who play the group of children were mostly from the Jewish school of Prague, because we were casting kids everywhere. And it was funny because it was very tough to teach them Shalom Aleichem. But then we went to the Jewish school of Prague, and I asked, do you guys know Shalom Aleichem? And, it was, the entire school was singing, but they're also, being Jewish in Prague, they are all grandkids of Holocaust survivors, I mean, there's no exception there. So it was very easy in a way to direct them because they knew how important this story was. And, with kids, you never know, you gotta be patient. But with the schedule that we had to get done really quickly. And when you're shooting with kids, you also have less hours. It was a blessing. You would tell them you need to be emotional in this scene and they would do it immediately. And they also had a very specific connection with Jesse. Why
don't we shift gears, Jesse, and bring you into the conversation? Thank you, Jonathan. Jesse, what made you want to work on this film? And had you ever worked with Jonathan before? Did you know his work?
Yeah, I knew of Jonathan's movies, but we had not met. And as Jonathan said, there was I had probably a multi-pronged personal connection to it, in that my family comes from near where Marceau's father comes from, which is also pretty close to where Jonathan's family comes from, which is like southern Poland. And as Jonathan said, my mother was a clown. She used to wake up, before the rest of the family and put on the same makeup that Marceau wore, and tune her guitar and leave the house to go entertain kids in the same way Marceau's doing it in the movie. And so I had an appreciation for clowning and mime. Of course, Marceau would not consider clowning, but I had an appreciation for that kind of like more abstract art, not just the kind of acting I do from an early age. And I just love the way Jonathan was able to make a story that's set against the backdrop of the Holocaust, but that really is the story of kind of a reluctant hero who is an artist finding a way to use his art to help others. I thought it was a great story that spoke to the way I would like to live as somebody in the arts.
Indeed. And it's certainly a compelling and complex part. And I think you bring it to life in an extraordinary way, but it's different from anything else you had done. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the first thing I asked Jonathan was like, do I have to speak with a French accent and do I have to be good at mime? And he said, yes. But luckily we have a lot of time. And I was so thankful. Well, initially it was kind of like a struggle because it meant spending, 9 months with an accent coach and with a mime choreographer. But I ended up just loving it so much because it kind of got us into the spirit of the movie. And of course, for the mime, allowed me to understand kind of like that discipline and how it differs from my discipline. And it was just, anytime you work on a project as an actor, you want to prepare as much as possible. Oftentimes there's not that much you can do practically because a lot of it is just realistic, portrayals of modern people who are quite similar to you. But with this, it gave me, between 6 and 9 months of work to feel not only prepared, but to feel like I understood exactly, what this guy loved about his craft.
Mm-hmm. Which shows, I think, certainly in your work. Both Jonathan and Jesse, you filmed, as you mentioned, in the Czech Republic and in Germany. What was that like?
Well, probably the most notable example, probably the most notable experience of shooting there was the scenes that bookend the movie, where Marceau performs for the troops. That was actually filmed in Nuremberg at a stadium that was unfinished, but was built to house rallies of, I don't know, Jonathan would correct me, 70,000 people, something like this.
Yeah, something like that. I think it was 50,000.
Okay. It seemed like 70. Yeah. I was thinking of the standing room only, but and so we were filming. So it was kind of eerie because you're filming on grounds that were intended to destroy us, and here we are making this kind of beautiful scene about somebody who was heroic on the actual location. It was pretty surreal. Oftentimes, when you do a movie that's a true story or the period movie or something, you're on stages in New York City or something, or and this was on the locations oftentimes of where some of the worst horrors either took place or were envisioned.
Right, indeed, and certainly being on that historic landscape is powerful. I've been there, and those are extraordinary. Yeah. Jonathan, can you talk a little bit about the tension between fact and fiction that Jesse mentioned? Of course, that's you both want to represent a historical moment, but you also want to tell a good story. So, how did you balance that, and how did you and Jesse sort of work that out?
Well, I think it's the challenge when the story begins in 1938 and ends in 45, and you have 2 hours to tell a story that takes place in 7 years. So it's always, about combining aspects of his life and sometimes combining events in his life that, get you through the story. I mean, most of it is either based on reality or is inspired by the essence of what I feel was the moment for the character. I mean, specifically this face-to-face meeting between Marcel and Barbie is something I couldn't confirm, from historical research, but they were running away from Klaus Barbie, and Klaus Barbie was chasing them, so it was a decision to make a face-to-face between the hero and the villain. And I guess that is the biggest, creative license. But for the most part, aside from the, perfect timing of a movie where, the escape to liberate the brother happens in a crowded square, all that stuff. I mean, it's obviously more cinematic than it probably was. But it's true to the event and to the character. I mean, I always say it's inspired by, not based on a true story, because at the end of the day, a lot of it comes from the mind of a person who's 106 years old. And, right. There's always, risk that it wasn't exactly how it was. But and for us, the essence of the story of a person who learns to mime in order to save children, and becomes an artist in the process was what was more important. The fact it's not only that he's using his art to save children, he's learning his art to save children, and that was very important to me. And I tried to shield Jesse as much as possible as to what was true and what was not true. I mean, I think it was probably once every 2 days that Jesse would come and say, "Did this literally happen?" And I usually would just say yes, because at the end of the day, as an actor, all you want him is to be focused on the reality of the event. And indeed, and that was what was achieved. The truth to the character and to the story. I think it's what Jesse really got across.
Well, and Jonathan, you mentioned Klaus Barbie. For the audience that may not know, you of course figure out that he's the great villain of the film, but he has an interesting story. He joins the Hitler Youth in 1935, really quite as a young man, and works his way up to Obersturmführer of the SS. We see him when he is in Lyon, right, and becomes what later becomes known as the Butcher of Lyon. He, of course, is a terrifying figure, and I think you cast it so beautifully. He ultimately survives the war and is captured in La Paz, Bolivia, and ultimately dies in prison in 1991. So that broad sort of history, I think you really capture that quite beautifully for the audience that may not know his sort of broad story. I think that's certainly very important. So Jesse, can you talk about a little bit about what about the story surprised you most? And before you answer, I just want to remind our audience that we'll shift to Q&A in just a moment. You'll see along the bottom of your screen a Q&A tab. Again, shrink your screen down if you're in full screen format. And please feel free to submit them, and we'll offer those in just a few moments. But what did surprise you about this story?
Well, the fact that the story occurred at all is surprising in the way that anytime you hear somebody who survived the war, it's a shock and usually involves some kind of miracle. But I think the most surprising thing about the story as it relates to like the movie more specifically is that it really depicts a guy who wants to be kind of taken seriously as an artist, being pulled into doing something noble. I think a lot of times when we hear stories of nobility, we assume these are people who are setting out with halos over their head to save lives. But I think a lot of times people are kind of inadvertently put in positions where they could do something heroic, and they make that choice, and history refers to them as having been permanent heroes. And so what I loved about what Jonathan wanted to do in the movie is show a story about a guy who, was a young, kind of petulant, stubborn artist who took himself seriously and took his art seriously, what he was thinking of as his one-man shows above all else, and then finding actually that the true kind of artfulness comes in connecting with some kind of emotional, experience that can only happen externally. And so that was probably the most surprising element, and it's what I love most about the movie.
Terrific. Well, we've got a ton of questions, as you might imagine, from our audience. So I'm going to weave some of those into our conversation. And I want to start with a question from Paul Kraaz, who I wanted to ask about the tone of the film. And he asks, he thought it was very interesting tone, but also risky to balance Marceau's whimsy, right, with the more harrowing scenes of the Holocaust. So both Jonathan and Jesse, as you're writing it, Jonathan, how do you do that, right, with laughter and, again, this sort of whimsical nature and, of course, the brutality of it? How did you strike that balance from a writing and directing standpoint? And then, Jesse, how did you strike it from an acting standpoint?
Well, I think I never saw it as a challenge. I saw it as what was exciting about it, because there is plenty of incredible Holocaust movies, that are, about that specific tone. What I thought was special about this is, like what Jesse was saying, this guy is not meant to be a hero, doesn't want to be a hero. He's almost bothered by the fact that he needs to now become a hero when he should be changing, the history of art, Right. And I think that fight is the essence of the story, how he becomes the real person he's meant to become because of the event that he thinks is stopping him from becoming that person. And I think that applies to almost all of us, how you always think that what's stopping you is the villain, but what's stopping you is the path you need to take to become the person you're meant to become. And I think that the truth to that story guarantees that you never miss a tone, because the tone itself is the struggle between a guy who is not in for the ride, but, inevitably becomes the only person who can take this journey and the person that we admire through the journey because of that. And it changes him, and we see his change. And I think, I'm not afraid of the event. And I think that's why I guess wasn't afraid of the tone, because it's my story. I don't see the Holocaust as this thing that nobody should touch. I see it as the story of my family, and I feel like I'm allowed to tell that story. And I thought that was what was exciting about it. But I love the question, and I love that he appreciated that.
That's a friend of mine who asked that.
Oh, delightful.
Yeah.
Well, there we go. Do you want to add anything, Jesse?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I love like the humor in the movie comes from like, you know, my character is like performing for these kids and the kids are laughing. When we were shooting with these kids, Jonathan and I would know if it was working if the kids actually liked it. And when the kids were actually laughing, we felt like, oh, then it works, because it's not like I'm performing for the audience who's watching the movie and we're hoping in the future edit of the movie they'll laugh. Like the kids were having these natural reactions to it, and it felt authentic.
Right.
I think in regards to that, I want to add something. I don't know if Jesse remembers, but that was a very special moment in the shoot when he did the pantomime for the kids with the bagels and all that stuff. He told me by the end that he thinks that's why this changed Marcel, because for the first time he wasn't performing mime for himself, he was performing it for the kids.
Right.
So he was able to completely forget about the technique and all the stuff that he's been learning for months, because that didn't matter. The only thing that matters is are they going to laugh or not. And you know, the essence of Marceau is how well he connected to the audience. And if you're a selfish artist, you're never going to get there.
Right, absolutely. I'm going to turn it to a question from Mark Ripp. He asks a question about the collaborator pins, right, that we see. Were they genuine or replicas? And then he asks a second question about why did Emma wear a collaborator pin after she witnessed the torture of her sister?
If he's asking if the actual collaborator pin that we used in the movie was real, it was. I mean, the great thing about working in Europe and specifically with a German costume designer is that they really have access to some of the vaults and some of the archives, and you know, it's pretty tricky to get like memorabilia from the period there. You have to have a permit because they want to make sure you're not throwing a Nazi party. But you know, we worked with a phenomenal German costume designer, and she was able to find that pin, which I actually didn't even know about, that the pin existed. And why did she wear it? I mean, I think the moment when she wears it, she's completely numb, you know, after what she witnessed. And I mean, she's ready to basically kill herself and jump in the train tracks. And but she doesn't wear it in the scene afterwards because Marcel already got her. But you know, she wears it because she's not there. She can't even believe what she just witnessed, and she wants to die.
Now I have both Jason Evans and Mark Leventhal asking a question about Patton, right? Ned Harris, a beloved actor. Can you talk a little bit about why you all bookended the story with Patton telling that story about Marceau? And does he really tell that story at Nuremberg?
Yeah, I mean, the why is, you know, I think there is nothing more unlikely as a war hero than a mime. You know, you think of war heroes, war movies, the last thing you think is a mime, which is, you know, in a way the more delicate art form imaginable. So when I learned that the first official performance that Marcel did was for Patton's troops, I felt like nothing would introduce this, you know, mime war hero better to the audience than an army, and the army that he performed for. Whether he did it in Nuremberg, you know, he was stationed nearby. I don't think he was stationed at the Congress Hall where we shot, but he was stationed nearby, so it probably happened very near from where we shot.
Okay. Next question is from Sandra Crane, and sort of a question for both of you. The theme of the film, of course, is resistance. It's the title, but also courage. And Sandra goes on to say that she says this is, of course, so relevant for us in these critical times. It's both timely and timeless. The debut of the film precedes Holocaust Remembrance Day. Was that intentional?
It wasn't intentional. It wasn't intentional, you know, that it was going to come out in the middle of an epidemic. You plan this releases, you know, a lot in advance. But you know, if there's something I learned, I remember the first time I spoke to Jesse, I told him that as an artist, if the war happened to me, I would think what Marcel thought is, why is this happening to me specifically? And I have to say, a few weeks ago, when theaters started closing right before my movie was going to be released, I caught myself wondering, why is this happening to me? You know, and it's interesting because it's not happening to you. You know, it's happening. There's an event that you happen to be a part of, and I think it's been special and different to release this movie at a time, because it's a movie about heroic civilians in a moment where we are witnessing the entire planet clapping for doctors who are the only ones who can save us. You know, sometimes you see images of tanks getting into New York City as if they could shoot the virus, you know, but the reality, there's nothing the military can do other than assist the doctors, who are, you know, people who went to the university to, you know, prepare themselves for a moment like this. So I think to release a movie about civilian heroes saving other civilians in a moment like this, and civilians that decide that survival is the only thing that matters in a moment where the entire planet decided to stop and forget about the economy, forget about all the elements, and simply let our doctors save the sick. You know, it has been very special, and I think it does have an aspect that has made it emotional, and the messages I'm receiving sometimes have been related to that, you know, how emotional people are when they're trapped in quarantine, and then suddenly they see this movie that reminds them that, you know, this will pass, this can be overcome, and we just have to, you know, be the best version we are of ourselves.
Jesse, we have a question from Ellen Mazer for you, that you've played a variety of Jewish roles in your career. Do you have a special affinity for Jewish characters? And do you have any particular standards in choosing which Jewish characters you will play?
I do have like a kind of like probably unconscious aversion to stories that exploit Jewish stereotypes. And I mean, that sounds like it would be obvious, but I think it's actually far more insidious than it might seem on the surface. Those stereotypes are often you know, these kind of like, you know, hyper under-sexualized, you know, panicky people. I've played like worried people, but they're usually funny or smart or something that I feel like is would be like, you know, higher on the list of attributes. I really get, you could see when characters are like coded as Jewish, not necessarily specifically, you know, explicitly said as Jewish, but when they're coded as Jewish and it's done in a kind of, I don't know, way that I find just disgusting. I see that quite a bit. Usually those movies don't end up getting made. So there's stuff that I would read that the public would never even see. But in terms of playing Jewish characters, yeah, I mean, when I write for myself, because I write plays that I act in, I write Jewish characters. It's something that when I started acting, I really tried to avoid, because I thought it would like limit me as, you know, an actor who could play anything part or whatever. But as I get older, and as like the world becomes a little more sensitive to actors playing the thing that is close to them, which is happening quite a bit now anyway, it just feels less of a concern and more of like a kind of wonderful advantage to be able to tell stories that feel that much closer to my history.
Of course. And we have another question from Jason Evans asking you to talk just a little bit about how you portrayed the mime scenes. Did you have experience with that? I know that we talked a little bit about that at the beginning, but how did you prepare for that?
It was really a exhilarating process. Jonathan found this incredible teacher. His name is Lauren Eric Salm, Salm. If you're curious, he's one of the great, you know, mimes. He studied with Marceau at Marceau School in France, and then has since not only become a great teacher on his own, but also become like almost a chronicler of Marceau's life. And so I had this kind of like two-pronged education. One was he was teaching me mime choreography that he made up for the movie that was derived from gestures and you know, the full scope of Marceau's work and teachings. And then I had this other education, which was about the history of mime and the history of Marceau. And I got it from a guy who was, probably aside from Jonathan, as adept and passionate a person could be. And it was just fantastic. And so I learned the routine starting in California, then probably 7 months before we went out to film the movie, maybe more, I can't remember. And then when I was in Prague, I had this other great teacher. His name is Tomsa Legierski. If anybody's curious to look him up, he's also an incredible mime. And he was on set every time we had to do mime. He is in the shot, if you remember in the bagel scene, he is in the shot when I roll over backwards. And I'm sure Jonathan would point to other shots, but I felt like confident enough to be able to do everything that I do in the movie. I think, right, Jonathan? Maybe there was a few seconds.
There's no other shot, actually. I mean, he was on set every time because we had him as a potential double in case Jesse couldn't do a specific pantomime. There's nothing he couldn't do. The only moment that, it was rolling backwards, because that's mostly like an acrobatic thing. That's the only shot where there's a double for Jesse. Everything else was done by Jesse.
It is extraordinary. So we have about 10 minutes left, so we'll have time for just a few more questions. But I want to do a quick shout out for all the people who've submitted questions: Howard Fagan and Jorge Pozo, Hyan Zhu and Andreas Rodriguez, Lindsay Fenton. We've got Amy Morrison, Cassie Liu, Kathy Ellis, Jason Evans, Judy Bozarth. This is from all over the country. And I think people have given extraordinary questions. Stephanie Kahn, Kathy Ellis, David Jacobs, Michael Dock, Ferenc Ortiz-Neji, Mark Ripp, Sandra Crane, Sari Earl. I hope I got everybody, and surely I butchered a name or two, but did my best as we're sort of working our way through. But I want to come back to just a few questions. And one really is, y'all both hinted at this, but I'd like to ask directly about the research that you did. Of course, Jonathan, you've been a writer for a long time, a screenwriter. Were you in archives? Were you doing primary and secondary research? And then Jesse, obviously you worked with coaches and mimes that knew Marceau, both either personally. Talk just for a few minutes about your research as we come close to wrapping it up.
Well, for me, it was, a ton of books. I went to the Museum of the Resistance in Lyon. I went to the Shoah Museum in Paris, to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. I even met with the Klarsfelds, who were the Nazi hunters who found Klaus Barbie in Bolivia. Like I said, I met with George Loewinger and his family, his son, who's only 88 years old, and was very helpful as well. And everything I could get. I researched Barbie for a long time. Being from Venezuela, I was always fascinated by the Nazis who were hiding in Latin America, and Barbie was one of the most famous ones. So it was a constant research all the way, and a ton of incredible books.
Great. And then Jesse.
I tried to watch every video I can of Marceau. Unfortunately, there's no interviews with him at the age that I'm playing him. So I was kind of watching interviews with a guy who was at the top of his field and was internationally regarded as one of the great artists in the world. So it was maybe misleading for me in some way, because I assumed, wow, this guy is supremely, kind of confident and well-versed in his own craft. But of course, you're trying to imagine what somebody like that would be when they're starting out. So, and then, for me, I'm also like Jonathan, but I didn't have an interest in Nazis in Latin America just because it wasn't part of my purview in New Jersey. But I was, have been obsessed and interested in the Holocaust, of course, since I'm young. The first play I wrote was about my cousin who survived the war and still lives in Poland. And I performed that play around the world 200 times. And so, I'm so interested in it as well. So to get to shoot this kind of movie in Europe and talk to Jonathan every day, who's has an encyclopedic memory, was fascinating.
Indeed. I want to bring one more question in from Amy Morrison. That this is a deeply emotional film. Of course, everyone knows that watched it. Were there particular scenes that were really tough to get through for both of you?
Oh, should I go first? I was at all times just panicked about the days that I had the more intense mime scenes. So that's not answering the exact question that she's referring to. Emotionally, it was a very unusual experience because you're doing this movie in this place that where it took place, and it's a real thing that I think about all the time, that my family, that we lost family during. So, it's a very unusual movie experience because normally on a movie set, you finish the day and you go home to something completely different. But here we were going home, and on the weekend, I took my wife and a 2-year-old baby at the time to like Dachau to look around. I didn't, it was amazing to be there with, my son, who didn't obviously have any context for where he is. And he was kind of laughing and running around. And I was initially kind of mortified that he was, laughing and, in this very somber place. And then somebody said to me something like, this is exactly what we want. We want a young, Jewish child to run around on the place where they tried to kill our, ancestors. And so it was this incredibly emotional experience because it didn't end. You'd do these incredibly emotional scenes and go home and be thinking about it and be in the place where, equivalent stuff occurred.
Well, and Jesse, I think, of course, and Jonathan, there's that great scene where you're talking to Emma about whether to continue to fight in the resistance or to turn the attention to the orphans. And you have this very powerful speech about the greatest form of resistance is to pave the way for the next generation. So in some ways, the experience at Dachau with your son does exactly that. It's exactly right. And that the true, the victory is that. The victory is that he's laughing on these, barracks that are no longer there. Absolutely.
So I don't know if Jesse remembers, we shot that scene the day after the shooting of the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
You're right. I forgot when it was. You're right.
I think Jesse's wife had new people there, and it was very, very emotional. And that scene was shot in Nuremberg. So to shoot that scene in Nuremberg after Jews are being killed in the United States in a synagogue, was particularly emotional for all of us.
Indeed. Well, gentlemen, as we come to the end, and our audience, I want to just close out with a question, sort of an industry question, that how the COVID-19 crisis is affecting both your work and the industry before we close.
I was supposed to be in Bosnia shooting something now, so that obviously didn't happen. No one really knows, but things are like actually happening. I mean, I have like meetings every day, like about future things, but I can't tell if it's because we're really going to do these things or we just want to have meetings. So, I think that's the feeling right now is no one knows what to do, but it's an industry made up of ambitious, creative people who, need to fill up their days.
Right. And Jonathan?
Yeah, I feel the same. I mean, it's very difficult to know what the world looks like in a month or making movies happens to be very much about a lot of people working together and in a public place, so it's difficult. I think it's going to be tough to get the right conditions, and we're going to have to probably change some of the things we do, the way we do them.
Right.
But, there's definitely a need to watch stories, and people have been watching a ton of movies and series online. And so I think we'll survive, but it's definitely a difficult, strange moment for the industry. I'm literally writing a novel right now, the sequel to my first novel. So I'm focusing on literature because I know that can go straight to the audience.
Indeed. Well, as we come to the end, I just want to close with a quote that Cassie Liu put on the Q&A, and I think it's an apt way to end. She said, "This is one of my favorite quotes that seems appropriate to the film. Art is our only salvation from the horror of existence." And with that, on behalf of the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival, Jesse and Jonathan, I cannot thank you enough for joining us, your willingness to be part of this conversation and bringing this project to fruition. This is an important film, reminding us that one person can change the world. If I've learned anything as a historian in the past 25 years, it is that. And with that, on behalf again of the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival, Jess, Jonathan, thank you. I hope you all stay safe, our entire audience, and I wish you a good evening.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Great.
Thanks to all the audience.